Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Please continue to eat. And if you're walking in, please grab some food. We did put out some pan dulce a little bit late. If you're interested in it, thanks to the Division of Mission and the Vice President for Mission. So please eat up there as well. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Jason King, the chair, the Byrne Chair and Director for the Center for Catholic Studies here at St. Mary's University, and it's wonderful to see everybody here, students, faculty, community members, administrators, gather here today for our McTaggart Catholic Intellectual Tradition Lecture Series. Before we officially begin, and before he puts another bite in his mouth, I'd like to invite Father John Thompson, the Vice President for Mission, to come forward and offer an opening prayer and a blessing for the food that we have already consumed.
It is good for us to be here, amen? It is good to gather, to learn, to share in the richness of our Catholic faith here in San Antonio. And so we pray. Oremos. Dios de amor, we gather today in gratitude to learn how our faith helped in developing San Antonio. We are mindful that St. Mary's plays a pivotal role in the Catholic story of San Antonio because of the contribution of the Marianist brothers and priests, which date back to 1852. We are grateful that these men responded to the call of God through the Bishop of Galveston, Houston, and came to San Antonio to open a school for Mexican and Mexican-American boys. Te damos gracias, oh Dios, por la cultura, la lengua, los costumbres, la comunidad y la vida de la gente de San Antonio. For many years, a Hispanic presence influenced and directed the way we would be church in South Texas. For this, we are grateful. Dios de sabiduría y entendimiento, open our minds and hearts to hear the words of Dr. Kanter this day. Bless her to proclaim your handiwork in the development of San Antonio, and help us to be grateful for that gift today and all of the days of our lives. We ask that you bless the food that we are receiving, and that you make our hearts ever grateful. In gratitude for all we receive this day, we thank you. Gracias por tu presencia en nuestras vidas. And let the blessing let us receive the blessing this day in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so very much. As I said, this event is part of the McTaggart Catholic Intellectual Tradition series made possible through the generosity and vision of Glenn McTaggart. Glenn and I have been talking over the last year to try to find a way to make these lectures more engaging and nourishing for the community. And so one of the brainstorms that we came up with, or Glenn came up with, was to have it over lunch and order Chick-fil-A. So the bounty that we are enjoying today is part of the brainchild of Glenn and us sort of working together. So thank you. I do believe that this is part of Jesus's ministry. If you think about what Jesus did, he went around and fed people all the time while he was teaching. So please eat, and then we'll sort of talk today with Dr. Deborah Kanter. She is professor of history, emeritus professor of history at Albion College. She's a historian of U.S. Catholicism and Latino history. Her most recent book, Pioneers of Latino Ministry, Claretians in the Evolving World of Catholic America, on sale outside for $10, and I think she'll be willing to sign at the end of this if you're interested. Examines the work of the missionaries as they serve Spanish-speaking Catholic communities across the 20th century. The book traces how parish life took shape in Texas, California, Chicago, under a bunch of different sort of conditions. Important for us, the book examines some of the story of Latino ministry in San Antonio and the role it has played in the broader development of Hispanic Catholicism in the United States. So I thought there was more, but I already introduced you. So this connection to San Antonio in the history and Hispanic Catholicism is one of the reasons why we're sort of bringing here today to talk. So please welcome Dr. Deborah Kanter. usually we do lectures in the evenings, but over meals, I feel the conversation would be a little bit sort of better, more sort of engaging, allow you to sort of eat. This is also part of the season, will be part of season 3 of the Center's podcast, Beyond the Lecture, where we talk to scholars who visit the community and get a little bit of their background and where they're sort of coming from. So I usually begin with the question of, how did you get into this? How did you get into being a historian? How did you get into being a historian of Catholic and Latino history?
Oh, this is working. Okay. So before answering your question, thank you all for coming. It's a really great honor and opportunity to come back to San Antonio, a place I really love. And I want to thank, in particular, Jason and Margaret for lots of the details for making today happen and getting you all here. I want to thank 2 people who are not here. I would not be a historian of Catholic Texas, which I still am a little confused that I am, but I am. But if it wasn't for the work of Dr. Timothy Mattavina, who will be retiring this year at Notre Dame, who wrote a great book about Guadalupe and her faithful San Fernando story. And the other person would be Father Bob Wright. They were very generous in sort of bringing me into the field. So, and they couldn't be here today. So how did I end up doing this? Let's see, where did I not get in for grad school? No, that wasn't it. So once upon a time, I was a historian of colonial Mexico. I went to graduate school to work on colonial Mexican history, worked in the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City and regional archives, and I wrote a book about gender and family in indigenous villages. Not a single thought about doing American history, because you didn't cross the border when I went to graduate school. But in the early 2000s, I was going back and visiting family in Chicagoland. And every time I would go to Chicago, it would seem like in the 90s and in the 2000s, neighborhood after neighborhood in Chicago was becoming Hispanic, largely Mexicano. And I was like, what? Like, when I was a kid, there was like one Mexican neighborhood. Like, there was the place you went to eat Mexican food on 18th Street. Boom, end of story. It was like, wow, now the whole northwest side of Chicago. And I decided in 2000 that I was going to research the story of Chicago's Mexican Catholic churches, because they were taking over the Archdiocese of Chicago. That led to my book on the subject, Chicago Católico. Please take a bookmark. That's why they're there. And when I got into this, the idea was not so much to do Catholic history. I wanted to tell a story of community building. How do people who are coming from Jalisco, Zacatecas, San Luis Potosí, how do they build new lives? How do they basically recreate their pueblos, their ranchos, or even like the feeling of like a provincial Mexican city? How is this happening on 26th Street and on North California Avenue in Chicago? And I decided I would do the churches because Mexicans like churches. If there had been like a whole chain of like Mexican gyms or YMCAs, maybe I would have done that. But I just sort of figured there'll be a lot of records. And then I fell down the rabbit hole, and 20 years later, the book was done. The beginning of Hispanic ministry in Chicago, this dates back to the 1920s. First Mexicanos, in the 50s, Puerto Ricanos began to come to Chicago. The ministry was entirely Claretian. They were the ones that came to Chicago. The Archbishop, or Cardinal Mundelein, invites them in the mid-1920s. Mother Cabrini apparently had something to do with this. She had a Claretian who was her confessor. I have not actually found the paperwork that connects the dots, but so the first half of my book is focused on one of the earliest Claretian parishes. And it's a parish which in Chicago, in common day parlance, it's La Catedral Mexicana, or La Catedral Hispana. And like, there's a real cathedral, like the real one, holy name, but Hispanic people it's this Claretian-founded parish, St. Francis of Assisi. So I was working with Claretian records. Half of the Claretian papers were in Chicago. I was getting to know the stories of these priests, many of whom came from Europe and spent their whole life in Hispanic ministry. And and then I'd find out oh, they also went to New Jersey. Oh, they were also in East LA. And so, I was kind of aware of a larger Claretian story. And while the Claretians are in Chicago Católico, that they're not the center. It's more about the communities, the lay folks. And I retired from college teaching 5 years ago, and I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I realized there was no book-length history of the Claretians in the United States. At that point, all of the archival material had moved to downtown Chicago. From my office on the 7th floor. They gave me my own office. It was lovely. When I was bored, I would look out the window with the L train going by. So literally the loop. And the archive, the Claretian archive, to me, it's the best Latino Catholic archive in the country. I seriously think in terms of the geographic spread of what it covers, and these are not all papers about the Claretian missionaries, the priests and brothers. There's a lot of, sort of day-to-day stuff of parish life and of the lay folks in communities, some of whom are represented in the slides that I put together. And so yes, I wanted to tell the story of who these Claretian priests were. I also wanted to tell the story of communities that are often forgotten. One of the places that I wrote about with a lot of love in this book was Martindale. Raise your hand if you've been to Martindale. So there's one blinking light, and it's not even in downtown. And downtown is 3 blocks long. So, and Martindale, Texas, why shouldn't people know about it? And it just had an incredibly vibrant Mexican Catholic community of people who were cotton farmers, sharecroppers. And they built a really amazing thing. They're still there. And the parish is still there. And another place, sort of a forgotten story, I found out 2 research trips ago. I was writing about Immaculate Heart of Mary on Santa Rosa by all the hotels. I didn't understand that there was a really vibrant neighborhood there, the Laredito neighborhood. And it existed until urban renewal in the early 1960s. And I was like, I want to tell the story of this neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore. And luckily, there's a beautiful book by a man named Roberto Perez about Laredito with a ton of photographs. And so I'm thinking about communities in conversation with Catholic priests. I don't write very much about the sisters, and I try and pay attention, but the records I had were on the Claretians. So I think of myself as being at this intersection between Latino history and American Catholic history. I guess that's why I do it. Yeah.
I want to just note, because you mentioned working at archives and finding records, and sort of so much of this work is dependent upon this. But I know at least 2 archivists we have in the audience. If you could raise your hand if you're an archivist. 1, 2, 3! Yes. Yay! And I know you've worked with some of those, and that work is pretty sort of essential for piecing together some of these sort of history with sort of document and sort of support on that as well. So, as you were tracing that history, and as I was reading the book, there's 2 tensions that I thought were sort of this back and forth sort of struggle in the ministry. And early on, I think it was that tension between the Hispanic culture and the European culture, and that back and forth, how do you sort of instantiate that? And part of that interest in that question is, I think some of the early days of St. Mary's was trying to also sort of negotiate the U.S. culture and the Hispanic culture, and how do you, with my mind, this context of Catholic identity. So first, could you speak a little bit about that tension? And then later on in the book, sort of post-Vatican II, the tension between sort of ministry and activism that seems to be sort of a tension that you have in the community as well. So could you speak about a little bit of that, the first and the earlier and the later sort of
The
tensions?
entire arc of the book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In like 5 minutes. Yeah.
So the Claretians were a mail order founded in Spain in the 1850s. And so initially they're all Spaniards, Españoles, or we might call them Cachupines. That's what I would call them as a Mexicanist. They came to Mexico in the 1880s. In 1902, they were invited to the United States, and the first ministry they were handed was San Fernando. Like, what a crazy thing to have your first ministry be the cathedral, right? And they're Españoles. Some of them have worked for maybe 10 years or 3 years in Mexico. I have seen the records from Mexico. They were pretty uneasy in Mexico. Like, they were definitely Españoles, right? And so then they find themselves in San Antonio. A few years later, they go to San Marcos. And so San Antonio is kind of their Plymouth Rock. Like, this is where everything starts. And initially, so they had two things they had to get used to here. They had to get used to, how do you work in the diocese and archdiocese of San Antonio, right? Like, who's the bishop and how do things work and what's a parish annual report? They weren't really doing that stuff before. And they had to, and when you wrote like a parish annual report and filled out the forms, or took out a mortgage, that was all in English. So they're having to learn English and, sort of learning the language of being Catholic fathers here. And they're learning to deal with their Mexican-American and newly arrived Mexican parishioners. There was a lot of growing pains in the first couple decades in this country. And
So it's like 3 different cultures you're kind of negotiating.
Yeah. And some of them, they really worked hard at becoming, proficient or bilingual in English. Other people didn't go so great. Some of them, probably they came older. There was a whole ton of people that come over in 1914, expelled from Mexico during the Revolution, and there's like 30 of them that descend upon San Antonio. They're all kind of overpacked at the provincial house. And most of them ended up staying here. If they didn't learn English easily, sometimes they would send them to Colegio Chaminade, which it took me a little while to figure out what that was. So it was a Marianist school in St. Louis. Like we're gonna get them out of like Mexican communities where they can get away with doing a lot of stuff in Spanish. We're sending them off to St. Louis, and they will have to learn English. It didn't work for all of them either, but okay. By the 1940s, the Claretians were training young men, and by 1940, they had a big seminary just south of Los Angeles, Dominguez Seminary. And also a seminary to the south of Chicago. And they were recruiting young men, mostly Anglo-American, European American, Irish American, German American, etc. But they were also recruiting a lot of Mexican American vocations, particularly in California. And if you were a Mexican American vocation from San Antonio, like in the 30s, your parents put you on the train to Los Angeles, and you left for like 6 years, and you were like 12. Wow. So I think I'm probably getting away from things. So eventually, by the 40s and 50s, there's this shift. We're going from all these Españoles to more, people who grew up in the United States, the Mexican Americans, many of whom are bilingual, right? The Americans, some of them learn Spanish to do ministry, others don't really. So, and so language is really an essential part of this. And one of the things I assumed going into the archive, I assumed that the seminaries really would have emphasized Spanish. And so I'm going into like, what was the course of study for 4 years at these high schools? I was like, oh, I know Spanish is gonna be there. In Illinois, you did Spanish for 1 year, and they usually like stuck you with a teacher who didn't really know how to teach. So maybe he knew Spanish, maybe he was an Espanol, but like he was a horrible teacher. So people were just sort of supposed to learn it on the job. So this is, and of course, in every generation, you've got a new wave of people coming from Latin America. So it's like, priests and sisters who are doing this ministry, it's helpful if many of them know Spanish, right? And especially today, over half of lay people in the United States are of Latin American ancestry.
Did that help resolve this early phase? Did that help resolve some of the tensions as you have more sort of generations, more people sort of born in the United States? Did that help resolve some of these sort of cultural sort of differences, or just the waves, keep the continuing waves of communities coming, keep that conversation going?
I think that there's tension still pretty late in the game. And one of the big issues, and it kind of gets to the later period that you mentioned, Jason, like the post-Vatican II period. So they come as missionaries. Like back in Spain, they're not parish priests. They're like supposed to be itinerant preachers, like to go out and do Semana Santa, right? And like, because the diocesans are not doing a great job. Anthony Mary Lorette, the founder, like he sort of believes that's what you do. You do itinerant preaching and you get people to care, and then you bring them into the sacraments on a regular basis. And that was what they wanted to do. They get to the United States and it's like, oh, you're in charge of San Fernando. 1911, they open up Immaculate Heart of Mary in this really kind of disheveled neighborhood with a lot of like jacales and adobes, and it was also kind of a red light district apparently. And they, they're counting the beans. They got to fill out the reports. They take out the mortgages. They build the schools. They get the sisters to come in from California, and they become parish priests. That is a lot of what they end up doing in the United States. And they end up working in like 15 states in the United States on a somewhat permanent basis. Some of these places longer than others. And then we get to the post-Vatican II era. And some of them are sort of pretty fired up about social justice issues. Some Claretians study at MAC, the Mexican American Cultural Center Catholic College, which is a place where Gustavo Gutierrez, the liberationist priest from Peru, this is like the first place he's coming and speaking in the United States. MAC becomes a very liberationist place. Father Virgil Elizondo was there. There were two Claretian seminarians, Mexican Americans, who get sent to study there in the mid-1970s. They do end up becoming parish priests, but they also want to like do actions, right? And the Claretians I'm in the middle of finishing an article about precisely this question. It's really stop and go. Most of the Claretians who are running, 15 or so parishes throughout the country, they need to run their parishes. And it's time for summer, and it's time for the annual kermesse, and we need to get the vendors set up, and we need to, make sure we have teachers for the school and all of this. And then there's a handful of younger ones who want to take more action. And there's no Claretians in this room. I can say whatever I want. So, and here we're jumping to our time, this current time. I was really struck in the last year and a half how long it took for the Claretian leadership to speak out about the immigration enforcement. I was like, the Jesuits are saying stuff. I know the Claretians are not in favor of what is going on. And with some of the stuff with visiting the detention center on the edge of Chicago in Broadview, finally the Claretians got involved and have a very public space. That was in the fall that they finally, we were pretty far into this mess that we're in. So now and one of the things that I argue throughout the book is one of the things that really stands out about the Claretians is that they accompanied Hispanic Catholics, for a very, very long time through many different regions of this country, which is why I call them pioneers of Hispanic ministry. And so it's really nice to see them taking a public stance and being involved with accompaniment in this time of really difficult position for immigrants. How many of you followed the story of Father Gary Graff, who walked from Pope Leo's house outside of Chicago to Ellis Island? Anybody follow that this fall? Oh, it's a great story. Step up and speak out. Father Gary, diocesan priest from Chicago. In parts of his journey, there were Claretians who started walking with him from Pope Leo's childhood home in Dalton, Illinois, into Indiana. They didn't keep walking with him. He did the rest of it with other people. So,
Did that early activism, I'm thinking now, like the 60s of Vatican II, was it the cultural sort of sense of activism? Was it the orders sort of looking back at recovery of their kind of itinerant sort of missionary sort of foundations? Was it a combination of those things? Because earlier you had linked up like, oh, that the initial vision was not to be, parish priests, but to go and sort of do this missionary sort of pieces. They became parish priests. And one of the movements at Vatican II was kind of recovery of your orders and your sort of identity,
right.
Which that seemed to come up a little bit in your book, but also it's the 60s milieu where a lot of those things are sort of shifting. There is sort of a different kind of theology emerging from Latin America. Do you have a sense of those dynamics?
I think the place where it might come out the most, and I have maybe 8 pages on this in my book, the Claretians decided they would go to the Willamette Valley in central Oregon, where you had farm workers, who were working with nut orchards and fruit orchards and this and that. And, theoretically, the Diocese of Portland was covering this. They were doing they had one guy out there, right? And the Claretians decided they're going to send 4 men up. And they made sure they sent men who spoke Spanish. They knew it had to be that. And it's one of the places where team ministry emerges. They're really working very closely with sisters and trying to bring in some Hispanic leadership. They're having these team meetings all the time. They're kind of very aware. This is the early 80s. They're pretty aware of what's going on in Central America. What's the 3 words? See, think, act?
See, judge, act.
Yeah, yes. So all of a sudden this is coming up in the team minutes. I'd never seen this in Claretian stuff. It's coming from a sister who had been in El Salvador before she, her mother house says, you can't stay there anymore. And so she ends up in Oregon. And I think she's kind of schooling the Claretians of what's a different approach. And, before then, the sisters were supposed to run the parish schools. But I'm noticing the thing in Oregon, Sister, I'm blanking on her name, but she's an equal voice at the table, and that's, I think, new for them. So the other place where it comes out, and I do talk about it, the Claretians from Chicago decide they're going to go to Eastern Guatemala, and they're going to build the church. And amazingly, I think they did build the church there. So it was a very unchurched place, Eastern Guatemala. This is the Atlantic coast. A lot of indigenous Maya speakers, as well as Garifuna people, Afro-Guatemalans. And it's like the end of the earth. And in the town, Livingston, Guatemala, it's the late 60s and there's no radio. I don't even know what does that mean? There's no radio. And so, they go there and build up a mission in 3 different locations. And and then they get through the 1980s and the civil war in Guatemala and the disappearance and murder of hundreds of clergy and many more catechists, native catechists. And the Claretians stick it out. And now there are Guatemalan and Central American priests, and a good number of Guatemalan and Central American Claretians, as well as diocesan. So that is very much, they're thinking out of the box in Guatemala because they have to.
You've already mentioned a little bit of the stuff from San Antonio, Immaculate Heart, and the Mexican American Catholic College or Cultural Center. Can you speak a little bit more about their role, the role of those two sort of institutions, or San Antonio sort of broadly?
So the Claretians, I
Pitch
think,
into the audience.
sure. And you're seeing, like, most of the images I picked today, they're all from Immaculate Heart, mostly. I decided I wasn't going to write about San Fernando because Tim Matavina's book existed. He covered it. That's there. And I decided, I was toggling back and forth. Should I write about Immaculate Heart of Mary or write about Christ the King, which the Claretians found as a parish, I think, in the early 1940s, although there was some kind of presence there already in the 30s. St. Elizabeth's was maybe what it was called. The pictures were better from Immaculate Heart of Mary, right? The Mexican workers building it, Leo Dielman building. They bet on a really big church for a really impoverished neighborhood. The amount of debt they took on to build that was pretty remarkable. That's 1911. So, like, the plans had been going on for a few years. Well, the Mexican Revolution, 1910, all of a sudden, San Antonio is just filling up with more and more people, many of whom don't think they're staying, right? They're here until the violence ends, and many of whom stayed, right? And then again in the 1920s with the Cristero War. So they took this big bet on this little Laredito neighborhood, and Immaculate Heart of Mary was absolutely the center of that community. So there were so many things going on there. In the elementary school, there were a number of men and women, and it was an entirely Mexican-American parish. A number of Mexican-American men and women who were vocations out of there. Like, if you're looking at the anniversary programs from the parishes, like, the pages of the sisters who grew up at Immaculate Heart of Mary is very striking. And the number of priests, including, how many people know who Father Luis Olivares was? So, okay. So, Luis Olivares, who kind of ran the show at La Placita in downtown Los Angeles and was really one of the fathers of the sanctuary movement in this country. I think he's the only Claretian who got an obituary in the New York Times. So he was it was a pretty controversial figure in a lot of ways and very dynamic. He grew up at Immaculate Heart of Mary. And another person, who grew up at Christ the King was Father Rosendo Urubato, who was the president of MAC. He was the head pastor at Immaculate Heart of Mary, and until about 2 years ago, he was the provincial of the Claretians of the United States. So, West Side San Antonio boy, and another one who had to take the train to Los Angeles to go to junior seminary. So that was where you went. And I'm very struck by the emphasis on, I don't think this is just a Claretian thing. I think it's true of many Catholic orders, the building of the schools, encouraging people to not just get through 8th grade, but you're going to high school and to have a vision of something more. And when I visit San Marcos, I'm a little struck by white-collar Mexican Americans whose parents worked in cotton. And it's like, how did this happen? And often it's a story of Catholic schools, right? And in Chicago, I noticed the same thing. Like, a lot of Latinos who went to Catholic school went on to university, right? I mean, you know that story.
Yeah.
I found out before that Jason's first job after college, right?
Yeah.
He worked at St. Pius V in Pilsen in Chicago, which this is from the Guadalupe Shrine inside of St. Pius's church. Everything's connected.
It was a wonderful school. I was the chapter 1 teacher for the middle schoolers and discerned that I'm not called to teach middle schoolers. But it was an amazing parish. And I don't want to skip ahead too much, but when I was there, I discovered this a crazy devotion, not me personally, but the whole parish has this crazy devotion to St. Jude Thaddeus, the patron saint of hopeless and desperate causes. This is in my office somewhere, and I brought it here because you talk about this in your book. So can you talk about just a little bit about the devotion to St. Jude? And how many people are devoted to the hopeless and desperate causes of St. Jude? Anybody?
Okay.
Yeah.
It has a national reach and definitely an international reach, but I think it's much more common in the Midwest and the Northeast. That's my sense. We probably would not have a St. Jude devotion in Catholic America if it wasn't for the Claretians. So one of the first like brick and mortar from the ground parish that the Claretians started in Chicago in the mid-1920s is called Our Lady of Guadalupe, and it was sort of amidst the smoke and underneath the smoke and the stacks of the steel mills, like on the border with Indiana. And when that church opens up in 1928, they were in a lot of debt building this church. It was not the fanciest church. Like the windows were just plain glass because they took them 30 years until they could actually afford $50,000 to put in beautiful windows, including the whole Guadalupe encounter apparition story. But in the 1920s, the priests, the Claretians in Chicago, they are desperate to get the Mexicanos in the neighborhood connected with this parish. Apparently in the winter, if it snowed a lot, attendance was way down. Because I'm thinking for people who are newly arrived, who's got money for snow boots, right? You go out when it's cold, but maybe not when the snow is like this. In the summer, the attendance was down because they were leaving the Mexicanos and they were going out and they were like picking fruit in Michigan or doing the sugar beets up in Minnesota. They were urbanish people who were also involved with migratory work, which is an interesting phenomenon. They run the first kermesses, the church fairs, and like they're just not getting a lot of money. And they do a raffle for a car. The Knights of Columbus tell them they should do a car raffle. They end up extending the raffle for like 8 weeks because they're not selling enough tickets. And the Claretians are like, but the Caballeros de Colón tell us that we have to do this. And it's not, okay, so things are not going great. And one of the sort of really kind of iconic early Claretian figures was a man named James Tort. And in 1929, he decides he's going to get 2 new images. He's going to try and bring people in with statues. He gets St. Therese of the Little Flower, and he gets a St. Jude Thaddeus. And he's like, let's see what happens, right? And he's keeping his eye on where people are gravitating who are visiting the church. And by the fall of 1929, they seem to be gravitating to the St. Jude. And then the crash happens. If we have found a time for hopeless causes, this is it. And it's so interesting, like reading, like getting into the nitty-gritty of the records. The Archdiocese of Chicago is sending the priests at Our Lady of Guadalupe really nasty letters telling them how much money they owe. And like they better start sending in some money or like the lights are going out at this little Mexican church. And Father Tort decides he is going to promote the bejesus out of St. Jude Thaddeus, and he really goes after English-speaking Catholics. He sends his little Mexican-American, like, altar boys, he sends them out to parishes with flyers. Come to our novena for St. Jude. And they're, like, going all over the city and, like, handing out flyers. By, I think, the early 30s, they're publishing a monthly magazine, The Voice of St. Jude, which we know today as U.S. Catholic. In the 60s, it morphs into its current version. It's a very classic Catholic devotional publication, entirely in English. And it was going out to lots of people in, New York State and Wisconsin and Ohio, and the whole thing develops over that. And then with some of the funds that they're gathering, they're able to build a brand new brick and mortar seminary on the Illinois prairie. All connected in with the St. Jude Police League of Chicago. Many of these guys, Irish American, not entirely, no Mexican Americans in the police in the 30s, 40s, 50s, probably. And the police league is going down to do these novenas all the time, and they're doing parades in Chicago, and they give an incredible amount of money. And they basically pay for these seminary educations. And I argue, I don't have like direct thing, but I think the money that's coming into the St. Jude devotion basically pays for a lot of working poor Mexican parishes to survive throughout the country. So that's the long and the short. Yeah. And for many years, some of you may know Professor Robert Orsi's book, Thank You, St. Jude, which is particularly about the the Euro-American women, the mothers and wives who had a special devotion. And he argues, you know, like in the 40s and 50s and 60s, it's very much of like a white ladies kind of devotion. And what's interesting now is it seems to be flipping and becoming really much more Hispanic. And it's got this whole online thing. Apparently they get, there's more online donations that come in. There's some huge following to St. Jude in Chicago that comes out of Puerto Rico. So I don't, things change, right? So.
Wonderful, thank you, thank you. I want to make sure we leave time for the audience. I think, do we have a microphone coming around? Oh, no, I'll repeat the questions. And from the audience, I figured like we can, if there's no questions, we can pray to St. Jude for hopeless and desperate causes. And gold stars for people that sort of start the first questions there as well. Especially, I think one of the things that I enjoyed about the book and enjoyed about the conversation is trying to think about this sort of ministry that spans the whole United States, but also sort of its location in San Antonio. And I think we have a lot of people that kind of see those origins sort of here. But open it up for questions from the audience. This is always my favorite part when everyone's
I
coming.
have a question for somebody in the audience. There was somebody, there you are. You clearly know who Father Rosendo Robato is. What's your connection?
In 1988, I was working for the Mexican American Cultural Center at the time, and he was leading.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Jerry Pollo. The question's about historical work on Christ the King.
Which is one of the really important West Side parishes.
So one of the things is like the Claretians worked in about 15 different states, and I would say they had, you know, for more than a year or more than weekly visits, they were at about 100 different locations in the United States. And as I started to get the lay of the land of this research, I was like, I am not writing an encyclopedia. I am not writing about the 100 places that they worked. Like, that would be boring. I'm going to find places where I have great Claretian records, great visuals. Visuals help me tell stories better. And maybe really interesting, like, lay communities. Like, they're just like something about this sort of mix of materials in place. And it looked like I had a better story from Immaculate Heart. And so I love Christ the King. And so I'm not working on that. And I did go on, like, I think on my last trip, I walked around it. And I wanted to walk around it partly because I knew that Father Rosendo, who sort of he was the provincial while I was working on most of the book, and was like a very kindred spirit. Occasionally, we had a couple little interviews. He was, as a young, just ordained priest, he got sent to Oregon. And he could not believe what he was in the middle of. He was like, there are no structures here. And I have his ordination invitation. What is it? Somos la Iglesia Unido and whatever. So he was ordained at St. John the Evangelist in San Marcos, and who ordained him? Bishop Patricio Flores. And Father Rosendo would tell me this like over and over again about how important it was that it was, Bishop Flores. And I didn't understand, I'm not from Texas. I didn't really understand at the time what that meant. And I'm learning. So I get it now. I get why that was so momentous. But Christ the King, it sort of seems like a smaller version of Immaculate Heart of Mary. But I didn't do the work, so. And something I wanted to mention, by the way, like the importance of San Antonio, out of Immaculate Heart of Mary, which is sort of where like the mother house was for the Claretians, there's still this big residence there. I think at different points, you often had 10, 20 men who were living there. They were going out and doing what they called missions from there, where they were basically running parishes, which you all know of today as like suburbs, right? Like they were going out every week to Jordanton. They were going out every week to La Soya. They were going out to, I don't know your geography that well. Exciting places in Caldwell County like Fentress, Luling, Lockhart. They were going to Cuero. They were going to Dilley, Moore, Pearsall, Elotes, right? A lot of the places they were going to, I can't find them on a map because they were like ephemeral places. There was like a place called El Picoso, the spacey place. I don't know, what even is La Mota Seca, the dried up dot? And I couldn't identify like what county these were even in. And these were places that they were going on a regular basis, and they would, somebody would get on this is often without a car, right? Like in the first decade and the teens and they go on whistle stop trains, right? Like even trying to understand what a whistle stop train is. And hopefully somebody with a carriage and a wagon would come and get them, right? So.
We do have a microphone, so if you raise your hand, it'll come to you.
I'm a retired diocesan priest here in San Antonio. I know the Claretians. I'm going to tell you a story about how kind they were to me. I was in a parish, and then I went away for a sabbatical for 3 months. When I returned from my sabbatical, I found that there really was no room for me to stay in at that particular parish. So I called Father Rosendo Uravaso, already a friend of mine at Immaculate Heart. He said, "Come on, Mike, you can stay with us." I lived with the Claretians for 2 years. My ministry was as a jail chaplain at the time. But I just want to say the Claretians have had a tremendous impact on this diocese. I've seen it. I've lived it. They've been around. They're with the Mexicanos. They're with the poor. They're for social justice. So I just wanted to put a plug as a diocesan priest for my brothers, Claretians. And there's been many other orders, of course, that have helped. San Antonio has always had a shortage of diocesan priests. We still do. We have we have more international priests now in this. I think we're up to about 3/4, would you say? Okay, it's a lot. We couldn't.
Mission
we
in
couldn't
reverse?
function. Beg your pardon?
Mission in reverse, people
Yeah.
coming from Africa, India,
Oh yeah,
Latin America.
India.
Yeah.
They always came from Ireland and Latin America. Irish are dried up, but Latin America, India, Africa. That's the kind of priests you're going to see serving in this archdiocese. I just wanted to make a comment on that.
Thank you for sharing that. And that residence that they have on Santa Rosa, which was built before the church, it's a beautiful building and it's quite capacious. And it can seem too big these days, but at different times it has been a place that has harbored people. What was I going to say? Oh, the Claretians, like clergy everywhere in this country, are experiencing the mission in reverse. So I was kind of shocked the first time I went to a Claretian, like their annual assembly at Mundelein Seminary outside of Chicago. And I was like, oh my God, there are these guys from Sri Lanka and Vietnam and India and Cameroon. I was like, like, what's the story I need to tell? Like, they're so new to so many things. And, there were a number of younger Indian American priests that get recruited. They were Indian Claretians. It's a global order, right? They get recruited to come to the United States, and the first thing that they would do would be get sent to accent reduction, right? And then they would get sent to Puerto Rico to learn Spanish. And it's like, well, it's a lot of whiplash, what the Claretians or any other order are asking people to do, which is sort of like the story of the Claretians in 1910 and coming here. All of, it's not just language, right? So, yeah, I spent a lot of time with a couple Indian Claretians who were working in Springfield, Missouri, and in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And they just, like, they didn't always get, I was like, they need to take Latino studies. So there were so many things that they didn't understand because they were new to living in this country and really unfamiliar with the situation. A lot of them, it's kind of remarkable how quickly they get up to speed. There are parishes where I go and I am there for Mass, and nobody's Hispanic Mass, and nobody's blinking an eye that the father is from Cameroon, right? So.
I was up in Casper, Wyoming, of all places, and it was a priest from Vietnam speaking to me in English, served a Hispanic parish, and had done his degree in Italian in Rome, where he also learned Latin. And I'm like, I'm barely at English. So it is kind of an impressive. We have time for one last question. If anyone wants to grab the mic for the last.
Extra credit.
I was curious if I could ask about, do you have a sense of the relationship, if there was one, between the Claretians and the Oblates in this region? Because they kind of, thank you.
Yeah.
Just asking about the relationship, if there was one, between Claretians and Oblates in South Central Texas.
I think they were doing parallel work, and I think my sense is that before Vatican II, I think they're doing parallel work, not exactly together. Like, they had their own institutions, a place where I really understood that, the title of my book is a little overblown, and the publisher at NYU, my editor, came up with it. Pioneers of Latino Ministry. Well, if I say that to Father Bob Wright, an oblate, he's not thrilled. So, and I mentioned, when you're talking about this area, you've got to talk about the Jesuits, right? Father Carmelo Francese, right? And the Oblates, definitely. So you had these different congregations who were doing this work. I think the Claretians, especially in, doing Hispanic ministry in Texas, that was called doing ministry, right? Doing Hispanic ministry in Chicago in the 20s and 30s, that was like building, new ground-up structures. The place where I realized that the Claretians were not doing something really unique was by reading Dr. Hinojosa's material about Hispanic ministry in South Texas, and a lot of your material was oblate, right? And I was like, this sounds just like my parishes. Like, they're having some of the same challenges and some of the same victories. What are the things that kind of bring people in? What are the sodalities, the lay people's organizations that are really building up stuff? How are they celebrating the build up to December 12th? The stuff which is in the, the Notre Dame volume, right? You have like an 80-page essay in there. I was like, it felt very, very, very familiar to me. And it let me know I was on the right track. So.
Wonderful. First, can we give a round of applause for Dr. Deborah Kanter? She will hang out for a little bit if you want to have sort of further conversations. There is books discounted outside if you would sort of like to buy them. There is food. Please do not waste food. If you are hungry, eat some more. If you have friends that are hungry, eat some more. If you think you might be hungry later, take some with you. We would sort of greatly sort of appreciate. There is cards on the table. It helps us to sort of give feedback, especially for future programming and stuff as well. And thank you all sort of so much for coming. Please have a wonderful day and take care. Thank you.